for this guest lecture?
Yeah, of course. Should I share my
Uh,
screen?
is it okay if we wait till around 5:05? We usually wait for 5 minutes for everyone to
Yeah,
join in.
yeah, no problem. Okay. Let me just open the first. Okay, I'll wait. That's fine.
Sorry, this is being recorded, right? Uh, uh, so the hummingbird, am I audible? Yeah, the hummingbird guest lecture will be made available soon to you all in case, I mean, for the ones who missed it. And deadline of assignment 1 and 2 is the same because assignment 1 had a much longer deadline because it was released 1 week prior to the course starting. So the course started on 22nd of Jan, but assignment 1 was released prior to that just so that students would get used to it, which is why the deadline is the same. I hope that answered your question. Okay, to be able to start soon. Oh, um, think it's okay for us to start. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's interactive live session for week 2 of NPTEL's Basic Ornithology course. Since this week we've been studying anatomy, physiology, and color, so we are honored to have with us Dr. Sahas Barve for this week's guest lecture. He will be discussing avian ecophysiology and plumage adaptations. He is the, the John W. Fitzpatrick Director of Avian Ecology at the Archbold Biological Station in Florida, and he is also an evolutionary ecologist, and his research mainly explores the evolution of behavioral and morphological adaptations in birds. All yours, Dr. Sahas.
Thank you, Nafisa. And good morning for me, everyone. It's about 6:35 right now, 6:35 a.m. Hope you're having a nice day. Hope you had a nice day, and hope you have a nice evening. I'm excited to share some research about bird feathers and bird physiology. So let's begin. Let me share my screen.
Uh, one sec. Can all of you just mute yourselves? Sorry.
Okay. Can you guys see? Oops, you can see my email, can't you? Hold on. Let me share the right screen. I swear I've done this before. Is that better?
Yes,
There you
yes.
go. Okay. And now are we now in presentation mode?
Yeah, I can, no, I can still see your slides. I don't think it's in presentation mode yet. Yeah, now it is.
How about now? It is? Okay, perfect. Um, so let me move you guys here. Or I don't know how to do this. Okay. So okay. So let me start again. My name is Sahas Barve, and I'm the program director of avian ecology at Archbold Biological Station. And because I work in Florida and because I work on non-Indian birds, let me give you a little background about who I am and how I got to be where I am. So I grew up in Mumbai, and I spent a lot of my weekends in college doing a lot of bird watching, which led to some really fun projects all around India as I did my master's and PhD. Um, and so I worked on foxes in Rajasthan and rhinos in Kaziranga, on king cobras at Agumbe Rainforest Research Center, and on Shola Sky Island birds as well. And now most of my research focuses on the behavior and ecology of this really rare bird, the Florida scrub jay, which I study at a biological research station in the States. But largely, I'm as an ecologist and evolutionary biologist, I'm really excited and interested in understanding how ecology and evolution affect bird biology. So how the evolutionary history or evolutionary background of a species might affect its ecology, or how the same ecology in different places might drive to convergent evolution. And we'll be talking a little bit about that in today's talk. So my research spans sort of two extremes of this graph. So on the one hand, up here, and I hope you can see my cursor, right, Nafisa? Yeah. So at this end of the graph, I take a really broad comparative approach to understand how multiple species are affected by the same factor. So I take a multi-species, large spatial scope approach, and it's a large temporal scope approach also, because I try to understand how hundreds of species sometimes are affected by their evolutionary history. On the other hand, I also take, in my current work especially, I take a single species approach to understand how single species, single populations are affected over a relatively small time. So the project I run is one of the longest continuous studies of any bird in the world, and it's a 54-year-long project. But 54 years is pretty small when it compared to evolutionary time, right? Evolution happens over thousands and millions of years typically. So 54 years is not that long, but it's good to go back and forth between those two timescales to understand how time affects species as well. So without further ado, let's move to the mountains, and we'll be talking a lot about mountain birds to understand physiology today. And I want to take you back to a scene that I would see pretty regularly when I was doing my PhD. And this is, I don't know if any of you are birders and if you've ever gone to Chopta, but on a good day, you can see this scene from Chopta, and it's the Trishul Massif. And there is it's actually out of the picture, but there is Nanda Devi, which is the highest peak that's completely within India in this range as well. So I love mountains and I love birds on mountains because mountains are bird diversity hotspots. So this is a map of the world, as you can see, and the darker the place, the more bird species are crammed into that space. And the cool thing is, without having any spatial information, just by overlaying how many species occur in an area, you can see the outline of all mountain ranges around the world. And so that's the power of mountains and how diverse they are. So you can see where the Himalayas are very clearly. You can see where the Andes Mountains are very clearly. You can see here the Central African Rift Valley Mountains. You can see the spine of Papua New Guinea, which is full of birds. And so mountains are biodiversity hotspots, especially for birds. So how do so many species fit on a mountain, right? So why are mountains such a biodiversity hotspot? And the answer to that is because each species sort of fits into a zone on the mountain. And so because mountains have that vertical feature to them, you can pack a lot of species one on top of each other. And each species is evolved to survive the unique environmental conditions that are found in that elevational zone. So here is a sort of cartoon graphic of several closely related species that occur along the same elevational gradient, each uniquely adapted to certain zones on the mountain. And these adaptations include physiological adaptations that we'll be talking about today. So this is a feature that is found all over the world. And again, if you guys have been to anywhere in the Himalayas, you know that you can't see a monal typically below 2,500 meters. You can't see a cinereous state above typically 2,000 meters, and so on. So there's an upper limit and a lower limit for every species. If you look at so this pattern where closely related species replace each other along the mountain range is recurring throughout the world, and not only in birds, but everything from bacteria to mosses to fungi to insects to mammals to birds, everything. So in the Adirondack State Park in New York State, you have two species of tits that replace each other, the black-capped chickadee and the boreal chickadee. Similarly, in the Himalayas, you can start with the cinereous state at the bottom. I'm sorry for calling them chickadees. That's what they're called in the US. But you can start with the cinereous state at the bottom of the mountain and end up with the gray-crested state at the top of the mountain. They're all closely related species, but they occur at different elevations. The same thing happens with sunbirds, right? So purple sunbirds are at the bottom of the mountain, and fire-tailed sunbirds are at the top of the mountain. So this recurring pattern of closely related species being strung along the mountainside is really fascinating to me, because I'm really interested in how these species evolved to be there. How do they adapt to the specific conditions that they live in, and why are they not found in a warmer place downslope or a colder place upslope? The other cool thing about Himalayan bird diversity especially is that this is sort of high school knowledge, but we know that the Indian plate was an island for millions of years until it crashed into the Eurasian plate about 50 odd million years ago. And the Himalayas started forming then as the Indian plate sort of crushed into the Eurasian plate. And the really high mountains didn't actually start occurring until about 15, 20 million years ago. By then, a lot of the species, or a lot of the genera, at least, of extant birds had already evolved. So there were already nuthatches in the world. There were already thrushes in the world, flycatchers, babblers. All these taxa had already evolved, and they colonized the Himalayas after the Himalayas were formed. Okay, so these bulbuls and white-eyes and fantail flycatchers and babblers colonized the Himalayas from the southeast, from the tropics, while birds like long-tailed tits, so what are they called? Black-throated tits and finches and nuthatches probably colonized the Himalayas from the northwest. So you had these birds that were separated by millions of years of independent evolution. Some evolved in Southeast Asia, some evolved in Northwest Asia, or North Asia, and then they met together and colonized these high elevations, like sort of simultaneously. So it's really cool to understand how birds, the Himalayas are a cool place to understand how birds that have evolved in isolation come together and live in the same environment together. Okay. So the problem with there's a big problem with living on mountains and living on cold mountains. So I'm going to ask, make sure our audience and listeners have a pulse. So can you type in, and Nafisa, I can't really see the chat, but why is it hard for a bird to live on mountains? Can you actually? I can.
Yeah, I'm typing.
Why is it hard to live on a mountain for a bird? Type in your answers. Vani says less oxygen, thin air. Dipali says thin air, less food. Ketki says temperature change. Awesome. These are all great answers. Now let's try and understand a little more. So what happens when you start feeling cold? Think about yourself. Think about when you are on the top of a mountain or in a really cold place. What happens when you are in a really cold place and you are not wearing the right jacket or right sweater? What happens? You shiver. Naveen says you shiver. Does anyone do anything else? You do energy maintenance, right? Okay, so let's go with Naveen's answer to say that you start shivering, and that's absolutely right. You start shivering. What is shivering? How do you shiver? Can anyone tell me, how do you shiver? What is actually happening when you're shivering? Muscles twitch. Absolutely. Let me see who muscles contract. So Bhaskaran said muscles contract. Vani also said muscles twitch. Absolutely right. So the muscles show this really fast twitching and contraction. And now tell me, how do muscles contract? Where do the muscles get energy to contract? Like what is needed for providing muscles with the energy? ATP, absolutely right. Hypothalamus signal, glucose, and what do you need to release that ATP from glucose? Basic biology. Oxygen. Archana got it right. So oxygen is required to release the ATP from glucose, right? In our respiration, this is like basic, again, high school physiology. So mountains are especially difficult place to live. Cold mountains are a difficult place to live because they are low in oxygen, but you need more energy to stay warm. So these birds have to maintain a really strong, high core temperature, for which they need to expend a lot of energy to stay warm, because they can't go to Decathlon and buy a giant down jacket. And they have very little oxygen in the air. So that's what makes high mountains really hard to live in. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how birds respond to what is called hypoxia, which is reduced oxygen partial pressure in the air, and how birds may respond to lower temperature. Okay, so let's start with hypoxia. And this is some research I did during my PhD from Cornell University, but I did a lot of the fieldwork in this wonderful place. Like I said earlier, I did my fieldwork in the Chopta area of the Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve. And this is the view looking north from, that was the other, previous view was looking southwest. This was the view looking north. You can look at this beautiful Chaukhamba peak. It's a really, really high peak. And the Himalayas are a really, really special place because outside the Himalayas, Karakoram and Hindu Kush, there is no peak taller than that in the world. So all the highest mountains in the world are concentrated in and around India, which is really, really cool. So this photo was taken again from a place that many birders now go to. It wasn't very popular when I was doing my PhD, but this place is taken from a place called Tungnath. And you can see this is really cool habitat. There's a bunch of snow partridges and monal and koklas, and if you're really lucky, you can see some accentors and red-fronted rose finches and so on. So hypobaric hypoxia, which is the lower partial pressure of oxygen at high elevations, is a really interesting sort of constraint on animals to study because it is universal. So it doesn't matter whether you are at 10,000 feet in Antarctica, 10,000 feet in the Himalayas, or 10,000 feet in the air anywhere in the world. The amount of oxygen will be the same. Okay, so the amount of oxygen changes pretty much uniformly across the world. And it is not affected by latitude or temperature. Because of that, there are hundreds or thousands of species that live on mountains that have all independently evolved to live in hypoxic conditions. So if you go to South America, there are llamas and vicunias that live in the high Andes. They have evolved to deal with hypoxia independently of bar-headed geese that live in the Himalayas and breed on the Central Asian plateau, which have evolved hypoxic adaptations separately from this cool animal called the deer mouse. Deer mice have the biggest elevational distribution of any mammal in the world. They go from below sea level to almost to 5,000 meters in the Rockies. And also yaks, right? So you can imagine all these different animals have independently evolved, and that makes studying how animals respond to hypoxia really interesting. Not only animals, there will be 3 independent colonizations of the high elevations by humans. So the Abyssinian people, or the Abyssinian group as it is called, lives in the high elevations of Africa, in Ethiopia, for example, has been living there for thousands of years. People have independently colonized the Tibetan plateau about 3,500 years ago. And then more recently, people have started living in the Andes about 1,500 years ago. So again, these are 3 experiments, 3 independent experiments of how when humans colonize high elevations, how they adapt to the hypoxic conditions. And I can answer questions about humans later. But to understand how birds respond to hypoxia, let's take a quick historical detour. This is the rather high peak in the Himalayas. It's called Mount Everest, and it was colonized by these 2 gentlemen, Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. Hillary was a lowlander. He lived in Auckland, New Zealand, and kept bees all his life, but went into the Himalayas and other tall mountains in the world to climb during the austral winter, which is our summer. So when it's winter in New Zealand, it's summer in Asia. Sherpa Tenzing Norgay was a Highlander. He was from the Khumbu region, and he was a Sherpa. So he lived and grew up in a high elevation environment and lived at about 10,000 feet or more for a huge majority of his life. So just like Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay, there are 2 kinds of birds around the world on mountains, including the Himalayas. There are what we are going to call Hillary robins, which live at low elevations for about 8 months of the year and go to high elevations to breed. And a common example of this might be pied thrush that comes to South India, or it might be Philoscopus warblers like green Asian green warbler that breed at low elevation, that winter at low elevations for about 8 months of the year, breed at high elevations. And then there are birds that we are going to call tenzing bush tits, like this black-throated tit, that live at high elevations all year round. So while Hillary robins live in oxygen-rich environments for 8 months and oxygen-poor environments for 4 months, these tenzing bush tits which are high elevation residents, live in oxygen-poor environments all their life. Okay, so these are two very different ways of living. So my question was, how much time you spend in oxygen-rich versus oxygen-poor environments drive your response to hypoxia? So does it drive how you are adapted to hypoxia? And so when I talk about Hillary robins from now onwards, I'm going to be talking about 9 species of birds, including flycatchers, laughing thrushes, and a couple of Philoscopus warblers. And when I talk about tenzing bush tits or high elevation residents, I'm going to be talking about these 6 species of birds, including a thrush, a Philoscopus warbler, 3 tit species, and a long-tailed tit, which is the black-throated tit. So the one thing that we do, okay, actually, let me ask you, what happens when you start, why do climbers have to acclimatize when they go to high elevations? But like, I'm sure you've heard of people who go and try to summit really high peaks. They try to acclimatize before they go. What is acclimatization? To increase erythropoietin, yes. Shift to right. Getting adjusted to connect, adapt. Great. Okay. So those are right answers. So what happens is when your body, my body, almost all vertebrate bodies, including reptiles, and we'll see birds also, mammals, when we go to an oxygen-poor environment, our bodies start producing more red blood cells. Okay, and more red blood cells means more hemoglobin, and more hemoglobin means that we are more efficient at extracting oxygen from the environment. And that is a really important thing when you're trying to climb a high mountain in a very hypoxic place, right? So acclimatization is basically letting your body adjust to the normal conditions and giving your body that time to produce those new red blood cells so you can increase your hemoglobin and take out more oxygen from the air. But this is what is called a low lander response, or what I'm going to call a low lander response, because there's a catch with increasing your hemoglobin concentration by increasing your red blood cell count. After a point of time, there are so many red blood cells in your blood that your blood becomes more viscous, and pumping that blood is more like pumping ketchup versus pumping blood. So the efficiency with which the blood circulates in your body goes down, and hence the oxygen delivery also starts becoming less efficient. And so after a point of time, having high hematocrit, or a high number of red blood cells, is actually maladaptive to living at high elevations. And that is why a lot of animals that consistently, permanently live at high elevations show this pattern of increased hemoglobin concentration without increasing the number of red blood cells, or having other features that increase blood oxygen transfer, which is not hemoglobin concentration. And again, I can talk to you more about that later if you have questions. So I was interested in understanding whether wild birds in the Himalayas show any of these patterns. And so I went around and I caught birds at different elevations using mist nets in Kedarnath, around Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary. Here is my friend Sartaj Singh getting a gray-hooded warbler out of a mist net. And we took a small blood sample and used a human hemoglobin monitor to quantify hemoglobin concentration and use the centrifuge to get the hematocrit. So we had 3 predictions. The first prediction is that within the species elevation distribution. Now, like remember to our first part of our talk, I spoke about how each species is found in a different zone along the mountain. So there's an elevational distribution for each species. Our prediction was that individuals of the same species at its lower end of the distribution had lower hemoglobin concentration because they were living in more oxygen-rich environments than the highest individuals of that same species. Okay, so within a species, hemoglobin concentration increases along the elevational gradient. We predicted that these resident species don't want to deal with high hematocrit because it increases blood viscosity, and hence they would show an increase in hemoglobin concentration without showing an increase in the hematocrit or the number of red blood cells. And finally, that these Hillary Robins or elevational migrants that go back and forth between oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor environments would show the same thing that human climbers show, where they show a strong correlation between hematocrit and hemoglobin concentration. So what did we find? We found that the Himalayan birds do show an increase in hemoglobin concentration within a species. So even within that small, narrow elevational gradient of about 500-700 meters, the lowest populations show lower hemoglobin concentration than the highest population. And our other 2 predictions were also right. We showed that these high elevation residents or Tenzing bush states showed no relationship between hemoglobin concentration and hematocrit, while elevational migrants showed a pretty strong correlation between hemoglobin concentration and hematocrit. So now, how do you increase hemoglobin concentration without increasing the number of red blood cells in your blood? And that is by increasing what is called MCHC, or the mean cellular hemoglobin concentration, MCHC. And that basically means that you're packing more hemoglobin molecules in each red blood cell instead of increasing the number of red blood cells themselves. Okay, so what we found was that these high elevation residents had significantly higher MCHC. So they had more hemoglobin in each of their red blood cell than these elevational migrants. And so they could increase the hemoglobin concentration without increasing the viscosity of their blood. So what this means is that not only that these birds have adapted to high elevations independently, but more importantly, depending on their life history. So depending on their ecology, whether they go up and down the mountain, yes, mean corpuscular, not mean cellular. So I agree, Vani. So going back to, so whether the birds migrate or not drives their hypoxia physiology. So there was a gray-hooded warbler, which is a Philoscopus in the resident group, and a gray-hooded warbler and a Blythe's warbler in the migratory group. And these are 2 very closely related species, but they show completely different hypoxia physiology based on their life history. Gaurav, that's a great question. I'll answer that at the end. So why is this important, and how does it affect birds in the future? So this is a graph of the number of species that are found at different elevations in the Kedarnath landscape. And so you can see that at low elevations at 1500 meters, in the summer and the winter, there is about the same number of species. At high elevations, at Chopta and above, in the summer, there are about 100 species, but in the winter, there are just about 30 species that live at these high elevations, which means that there are 70% of the bird fauna there is an elevational migrant. And so we don't know, as climate change pushes birds upslope, as the earth warms and climate change pushes birds upslope, we don't know how far these elevational migrants can go, because they're probably limited by how much they can increase their hematocrit. Versus we also don't know how high these high elevation residents can go, because they are probably limited by how much they can increase their hemoglobin concentration as well. So understanding how hypoxia drives cold tolerance and hence where birds live is going to be really, really important. So with that, let's step to the next part of our talk, which is understanding how birds survive cold temperatures at high elevation. And this part of the project is simply called "Do Himalayan Birds Wear Down Jackets?" And this is this was a project that I did during one of my postdoctoral fellowships at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. So we talked about how the oxygen level in the air changes along the mountain, but you also, I'm sure, know that mountains are higher as the higher you go, right? Are colder the higher you go. So in this picture, you can tell that the top of the mountain is significantly colder than the bottom of the mountain. There's all ice and snow. There's no ice and snow here. So this is the mountainside, and I don't know if again this has become a very popular trek now. This just behind this top is another famous Shiva temple called Rudranath now, and you can climb from Mandal to Rudranath in a day. If you're really fit, you can do it in a day. So in a day's walk, you can go from cold alpine tundra at about 13,000 feet to subtropical forest at 5,000 feet, which are two completely different environments with a bunch of different environments in the middle as well. So there's you go from cold alpine tundra to rhododendron forest to oak forests to more subtropical forests. But the inspiration for this part of the research came from when I was doing my PhD again, and I was out trying to understand what birds are eating and how they forage. And so I was out. It was at about 10,000 feet. So I was in a place called Shokhark, and it was I was at 10,000 feet. I was in the winter, and it was about minus 10 degrees Celsius. I was out wearing pretty much every piece of clothing I owned because it was so cold. And I was trying to understand how birds survive this really cold environment and how they forage. The problem was, for the longest time, I couldn't even find a single bird to even observe. But then I found this guy. This guy, does anyone know what bird this is? Maybe there are some birders in the... Aditya is absolutely right. That's goldcrest, Regulus regulus. So goldcrest, I suddenly saw a goldcrest, which is not exactly a type of warbler, but closely associated with warblers, evolutionarily speaking. So I saw a goldcrest, and it was foraging actively at the top of this spruce tree. And I was like, awesome, I finally found a bird. Let me get some data. I took my hand out of my glove to start writing, and my hand almost instantly froze, and I couldn't write anymore. And that's when I realized that this bird was doing something incredible. Goldcrests weigh about 6 grams. Okay, 6 grams is about a teaspoon of sugar. The core of the goldcrest has to maintain its core at about 40 degrees Celsius. And this is something that I'm sure Anusha talked to you about in her hummingbird talk as well. Birds have to maintain their core at about 40 degrees Celsius. The outside air, like I said, was minus 10 degrees Celsius. That's distance between the outside air and the goldcrest's heart was probably less than an inch, but it had to maintain a gradient, a continuous constant gradient of about 50 degrees Celsius between its heart and the outside air all day long just to survive. And as I'm sure Anusha mentioned in her talk, I'm assuming Anusha gave the hummingbird talk. I can't imagine anyone else giving. So they have these really cool adaptations called torpor. But during the day when they're actually feeding, they still have to maintain their body temperature. So I was just blown away by the fact that this small one teaspoon of sugar-sized bird was doing this incredible feat of surviving really high, just really high hypoxic environments. And so, because I was wearing a down jacket, I was like, maybe the bird's feathers are really well adapted to surviving cold places. So let's quickly understand how birds keep warm. Birds have an outer layer of feathers, which keeps them insulated from the outside air. They can also increase their metabolic rate, which means that they can start shivering, or they can drop their metabolic rate also, right? But they can increase their metabolic rate to start shivering and produce body heat. But they also show several behaviors, like what is huddling. These European beavers are showing huddling. A lot of birds also do elevational migration, so they just leave the cold environment and survive cold by leaving the cold. So we are going to talk about feathers, and because this is a sort of intro ornithology course, I'm going to quickly do feathers 101. There are three birds typically have, broadly speaking, three types of feathers: wing feathers, tail feathers, and what are called contour or body feathers. They, of course, have other types of feathers like rictile feathers and stuff like that. And each of these contour feathers, I don't know why this, anyway, so each of these contour feathers is made up of two parts. The lower part that you can see here is made up of these non-interlocking barbs. So the central vein of the feather is called a rachis, and from the rachis come what are called barbs. And the lower part of the feather is made up of non-interlocking barbs, which are called downy barbs or plumulaceous barbs. The top part of the feather is made up of interlocking barbs, which are also called pennaceous barbs. Now, these downy parts or downy barbs or plumulaceous barbs are the ones that are supposed to be really important for trapping pockets of air and keeping the bird warm, just like your jacket does. Your sweater and jacket does exactly that. They trap a little bit of air. So the sweater itself is not keeping you warm. The air that it traps is keeping you warm. And the top part of this feather is or the pennaceous part of its feather is often the colorful part of the feather and the part of the feather that keeps the bird waterproof. Now, to give you a simple example of whether birds that live at cold places have more downy feathers, as is predicted by science, let's see the feathers of two owls that live in very different environments. So the snowy owl, of course, as I'm sure you know, lives in cold Arctic conditions, and it has a huge portion of its feather made up of the downy region. And this burrowing owl from San Diego, California, which is a warm, sunny place, has a very small part of its feathers made up of the downy barbs, right? So the prediction is that the more downy the feather, or rather, the colder a bird's habitat, the more downy its feathers. The other thing birds can do is actually layer their feathers on top of each other. So I'm sure you have done this also. You can also just wear multiple layers, and that keeps you warmer. So you can wear 6 t-shirts, and you will be significantly warmer than if you wear 1 t-shirt, right? But none of those t-shirts are jackets. So just like that, what birds can do is layer their feathers one on top of each other and trap, again, pockets of air and conserve heat. So I was really interested in understanding whether birds that live at the top of the mountain have very different feathers structurally than birds that live at the bottom of the mountain. And because we talked about this tropical and temperate evolutionary history, I was really interested in understanding whether birds that have evolved in the tropics in Southeast Asia and then colonized the high elevations have evolved feathers that are different from birds that have evolved in the temperate North and Northwest Asia, right? So birds that evolved in cold places, do they have different feathers than birds that evolved in warm places? So what I predicted was that the proportion of down will increase with elevation, that temperate and tropical taxa will have differences in their insulation, and that small birds, because they have a bigger surface to volume ratio, which means they lose heat faster than big birds, that they will be more insulated in general. Okay, so what I did was I took specimens of Himalayan birds where we knew what the elevation of collection, and took a photo under the microscope. And this is what a minivet feather looks like. It's red out on the outside, but that downy region is really gray, dark, and white. Okay, so it looks very different. And then again, this is a feather of a wren babbler from I think this came from Namdafa. And so again, you can see the downy part of this feather, which is very different looking than the pennaceous part. And so I measured these feather variables on these birds. Disha, I'll answer your question at the end. So I did this for over 1,700 specimens and over almost 250 species. And then I used some statistics, these methods called phylogenetic comparative methods, where you sort of compare bird feathers, but also sort of the underlying assumption, or sort of you're controlling for the fact that some birds are more closely related to each other than other birds. For example, when I'm comparing flycatchers to each other, or flycatchers to minivets, the assumption is that there should be fewer differences in the feathers of the flycatchers, because they are more closely related to each other than any flycatcher is to a minivet. So I found that both tropical and temperate birds increase the amount of down in their feather at high elevations. So as you go up in elevation, the amount of down in the feather increases. And we showed that small birds have longer feathers, and which means that these small birds, which lose heat very quickly, have longer feathers than large birds. And yes, Diwali, they're all dead birds. Yes. This also means that small birds have disproportionately longer feathers than big birds. So imagine what it means is that these small birds, because they have longer feathers, are layering their feathers more than the big birds, which probably need to lose that heat sometimes really quickly as well. Okay, so because we found this pattern of increasing down at increasing elevations and lower down at and longer feathers at lower elevations, lower down at lower elevations, and shorter feathers in big birds and longer feathers in long birds, we, across all these 249 species, we know that these patterns are probably very, very widespread across all birds around the earth. And so a lot of I'm doing a few other projects where I'm looking at whether Himalayas are a unique case, or if similar adaptations have evolved in the Andes and in the Rocky Mountains in the Americas. So a quick example of that is understanding these birds, a species pair that lives very close to the equator. So there's a isolated range of mountains called the Santa Marta Mountains in northern Colombia, and we looked at specimens of birds from these mountains. And just like the cinereous tit is replaced by the greenback tit, we have Hynecorrhina anacorrita, which is a high elevation wren, which replaces this Hynecorrhina leucophris from the low elevations. And we found very similarly that these high elevation birds have significantly longer feathers than low elevation birds, which is again showing that feathers are really important for keeping warm. So when you think about birds next time, especially when you're in Kashmir or in Oli or any cold place, think of the incredible feat they are doing by keeping their bodies warm using their feathers and survive, especially if you're on top of a mountain. Think about how hard it is for a bird, a really small bird, to extract enough oxygen from the air to survive there. And this black-faced warbler is a great example of what birds will do. They will just puff up, trap a bunch of air, warm it, and then use it for thermoinsulation. So I hope I've convinced you that feathers and metabolism are both important for this. And something that I'm really interested now is understanding the drivers of color in this as well. So I'm actually measuring specimens to understand whether color. So does red color plus downy feathers make a bird warmer than, say, white color and downy feathers? So I'm trying to understand in the same birds where in those 249 species where I quantified down, which is not exposed to the sunlight, I'm looking at whether birds have heat absorbent colors as well. So with that, I would like to thank all the people that worked with me on all these projects, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for your lovely talk. We will be looking at questions now, if that's okay with you to answer some of them.
Anushka, that was not a yellow-bellied fantail. That was a black-faced warbler. But that's a great question because a lot of people think that they mimic each other in mixed species flocks. Penchen, what do you want to know about the Grandala? They are very high elevation birds, and potentially they are the highest nesting bird in the Himalayas also, although we don't know what the record is. Oh, great question, Sushila. So it is assumed that black, just like typically black absorbs more heat, that black birds will absorb more heat as well, and white birds will absorb the least heat because they will reflect most of the light energy that is incident on their feathers. So darker birds will absorb more heat than lighter birds. That's again, I missed that question. I can see the questions also, but okay. Gaurav Soman asked a really interesting question. And the color in birds is driven by a whole range of things, right? So the color in birds is driven by their need to camouflage against predators, but also to attract mates. And so it is not just driven by whether they live in a cold or warm place. And so birds have to have these trade-offs about how these colors evolve. So males and females at high elevations might have different colors to attract mates. Nafisa, if you want to go ahead and they're coming in really fast, so if you want to help me with some questions, that'd be great.
Sure. So someone asked, how do modifications in the tail of birds, such as what we see in drongos, green-tailed beaters, etc., help?
That's a great question. That's more of a biomechanics question. So it is assumed that these birds are either using their tails to attract mates, or their tails are uniquely modified to help them forage. So I'm not a mechanical engineer, so I'm not in the right place to talk about that. But like woodpecker tails are very important because they have these really stiff feathers that prop them up. They use it like a fifth limb. So tail feathers are definitely important. I wanted to take a quick question that I just saw coming, how birds deal with diet, how they maintain their food scarcity at high elevation. So that's really interesting question, and a really understudied question in especially Himalayan birds. We know that so Eurasian jays are found in the Himalayas and across Europe. And we know that jays in Europe store food, so they cache food in the ground in the autumn season, but we don't know any of that in the Himalayas. So a great way that birds survive food scarcity in the winter is by caching food. Tits are known to cache food also. Nuthatches are known to cache food also, but we have no studies that actually quantify how much food is cached and how much of that cached food is actually retrieved by those birds.
Someone asked color pattern and sexual selection. Is there any correlation?
Yeah. So is that the last question from Ahilya?
There are a lot of questions. I think in case we run out of time, you can just send them over at the discussion forum and we can mail them to Dr. Sahas as well.
Yeah. So I'll quickly go through these also. Then why most animals in cold environments are white? Tanmay, that's a great question. Because that's the trade-off I was talking about earlier. A lot of Arctic animals are white because they need to camouflage. If they were black, they would stand out and get eaten by predators all the time. And so it's a good question. You have to there are trade-offs for how evolution works.
Disha Sawant
Uh,
asks, does molting play any role?
Yeah, that's a great question again, and we have no idea. Great, something that you can study. So we know that birds replace all their feathers at least once a year, and many birds replace their feathers twice a year. So we know that greenish warbler, for example, replaces all its feather twice a year, and we don't know whether its winter plumage is less or more insulative than its summer plumage. My prediction would be that winter plumage is less insulative because greenish warblers spend most of their winters in South India, which is where it's pretty warm, versus where they breed at high elevations in the winter. But that's something that you can go and study.
There's one question. How does the color of feather pattern differ in males versus females at high elevation?
Yeah, so there is no. So what I can tell you is that the insulative capacity of those feathers does not vary. Although I didn't show you those data, males and females had similarly insulated feathers. The pennaceous part, which is the colorful part of the feather, will vary because they are probably driven by other drivers like sexual selection or whether the female plays a bigger role in nesting or not. So typically in birds that uh, paradise flycatcher is of course a big exception to that, but in most cases females that where birds in which males don't play a big role in the nesting biology, they are more brightly colored than females who have to be cryptic and camouflaged to remain to protect their nests.
Thank you. Do you want to take more questions or?
Yeah, sure. I can take questions for 4 more minutes.
Yeah,
It was mentioned. Let's take the last one. It was mentioned that
sure,
one
sure.
bird moves to high elevations for breeding. Why does the other? Why that bird species goes to high elevations instead of going to lower elevations? That's a that's a $64,000 question. And PNM, I don't know. We don't know how there are two hypotheses. The two hypotheses is that even though it is colder, there are fewer predators at high elevations than there are at lower elevations, and there are fewer parasites at high elevations than there are at low elevations also. And so that those might be the two reasons why a lot of birds move from low elevations to high elevations to breed. But again, a lot more research needs to be done. There's a really wonderful paper by Alice Boyle that tries to look at it in neotropical birds.
Thank you so much for answering all these questions and for this lovely lecture, even though
Yeah.
despite the time zone differences.
Oh,
Thank
no
you so
problem.
much for
Yeah,
your
it was
time.
great talking to you guys.
This was a lovely
All right.
talk.
Yep.
Thank you so much
Take
to
care, guys.
everyone who joined in as well.
All
And
right.
just you can type in your questions and we'll mail them to Dr. Sahar. So don't worry if you couldn't ask all of your questions here. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, Nafisa. Thank you so much.
Bye bye. Thank you.